Chief Petty Officer Frank "Ghost" Morrison was loading groceries into his pickup truck outside the Walmart in Virginia Beach when he felt someone watching him with the kind of intense attention that made his combat instincts kick in after 40 years of civilian life. The 68-year-old Vietnam veteran had spent decades trying to blend into crowds, avoiding the recognition that came with being one of the original Navy SEALs who'd operated in the Mekong Delta during the darkest years of the conflict, when their missions were classified and their existence was officially denied by a government that needed plausible deniability for operations that pushed the boundaries of international law. What Frank didn't expect was that reaching for a bag of dog food would expose the faded tattoo on his forearm, a simple anchor with SEAL Team 1 1967 beneath it, to Petty Officer Second Class Jake Martinez, a 24-year-old SEAL who'd studied the classified histories of his unit's founding fathers and was now staring at a ghost from the Brotherhood's most legendary era. Jake stood frozen beside his own shopping cart, his eyes locked on the tattoo that every modern SEAL learned about in their unit history classes but that none of them had ever seen in person. SEAL Team 1, 1967, the year that unconventional naval warfare became a deadly art form in the rice paddies and river systems of Southeast Asia, when men like Frank Morrison had written the tactical manual for special operations in hostile territory. "Sir," Jake said quietly, approaching Frank with the kind of respectful caution that junior enlisted use when they encounter military royalty. Is that a real SEAL Team 1 tattoo?" Frank looked up from his grocery cart, noting the young man's military bearing, the fresh haircut, and the unmistakable confidence that came from completing the most demanding military training in the world. Modern SEAL, probably based at Little Creek, definitely active duty. "Son, it's just an old tattoo from a long time ago." "Sir, with respect, that's not just any tattoo. SEAL Team 1 was the first. You guys created everything we do now." Frank felt something uncomfortable settle in his stomach. He'd spent 40 years avoiding conversations about his military service, deflecting questions about his time in Vietnam, and never discussing the classified operations that had shaped modern special warfare doctrine. "Kid, I'm just trying to buy groceries and get home to my dog." Jake studied the older man more carefully, noting the way he moved with economic precision, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, the casual alertness that never completely fades from operators who've survived combat. "Sir, my name is Petty Officer Martinez, SEAL Team 4. I've studied your unit's operations in the Mekong Delta. You guys were legends before anyone knew SEALs existed." Frank finished loading his groceries and closed the tailgate, hoping to end a conversation that was heading into territory he'd spent decades avoiding. "Martinez, I appreciate your service, but I think you've got me confused with someone else." "No sir, I don't think I do. SEAL Team 1, 1967. There weren't many of you, and you operated under classification levels that weren't declassified until the 1990s. Jake pulled out his phone and showed Frank a photograph from a military history website, a group of young SEALs standing beside a river patrol boat in the Mekong Delta, their faces blacked out for security reasons but their unit patch clearly visible. "Sir, this is your team. Operation Phoenix, 1967 to 1970. Deep reconnaissance, direct action, prisoner snatch operations. You guys were doing things that wouldn't be acknowledged by the Navy for 30 years. The first twist came when Frank realized that Jake wasn't just a curious young SEAL, he was a military historian who'd spent years researching the classified operations that had established the SEAL reputation for unconventional warfare. "Martinez, where did you get that information?" "Sir, I wrote my Naval War College thesis on early SEAL operations in Vietnam. Your unit's after-action reports were declassified in 2018 as part of the Pentagon Papers release." Frank felt the world shift beneath his feet. For 40 years, he'd believed that his service in Vietnam was buried in classified files that would never see daylight. The idea that young SEALs were studying his operations in military schools was both terrifying and surreal. "What exactly do you know about what we did over there?" Jake looked around the parking lot, noting that their conversation was attracting attention from other shoppers who were beginning to recognize that something significant was happening between the old man and the young soldier. "Sir, I know that SEAL Team 1 conducted 847 classified missions in the Mekong Delta between 1967 and 1970. I know that your kill ratio was 30-1, and that you never lost a teammate to enemy action. I know that your unit developed the small boat tactics that modern SEALs still use today. Frank stared at the young man who was reciting operational details that Frank hadn't discussed with anyone, including his own family, in over 5 decades. Martinez, how many people know about this research? Sir, every SEAL team learns about the original units during their unit indoctrination. You guys are part of our heritage training. We study your tactics, your mission planning, your operational security. The second twist came when Jake revealed information that Frank had never known about the long-term impact of his Vietnam service. Sir, can I ask you something? Do you remember Operation Blackwater, October 1968? Frank's hands tightened on his truck keys. Operation Blackwater was the mission that still woke him up in cold sweats, the night when everything had gone wrong and somehow gone right, when his team had extracted a high-value target under impossible circumstances. Martinez, that operation is still classified. No sir, it's not. The after-action report was declassified last year. Your team saved a South Vietnamese colonel who provided intelligence that prevented a major NVA offensive. The intelligence you recovered led to the disruption of 3 enemy supply networks. Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. Sir, that colonel you extracted? His information saved approximately 2,000 American lives over the next 6 months of the war. Frank felt something break inside his chest. For 50 years, he'd carried the weight of that night, the violence, the moral ambiguity, the young faces of enemy soldiers who died in a jungle that most Americans couldn't find on a map. How do you know that? Sir, it's in the historical analysis that was compiled by Naval Special Warfare Command. Your missions weren't just tactical successes, they had strategic impact that affected the entire course of the war. The third twist came when Jake explained why he'd been researching Frank's specific service record. Sir, I need to tell you something. My grandfather was Lieutenant Colonel Roberto Martinez, Army Rangers, wounded in action near Anlock in 1969. Frank studied Jake's face, noting familiar features that reminded him of someone he'd met briefly in a military hospital decades earlier. Martinez. Army Rangers. I think I remember meeting a wounded Ranger officer at the 3rd Surgical Hospital. Yes sir. Grandfather said a Navy SEAL visited him in the hospital. Said the SEAL told him that his wounds meant he'd fought bravely, not that he'd failed. Said that conversation saved his life when he was considering suicide. Frank's memory shifted into focus. The young Army officer, multiple shrapnel wounds, convinced that his injuries made him a failure as a soldier. Frank had been visiting his own wounded teammate when he'd overheard the Ranger talking about not wanting to go home damaged. Your grandfather, he was going to refuse medical evacuation. Yes sir. Until you told him that scars were proof of courage, not evidence of failure. He came home, raised a family, became a teacher. He always said a Navy SEAL gave him permission to live with his wounds instead of dying from shame. Jake's voice broke slightly as he continued. Sir, my grandfather died 2 years ago. His last request was that I find the SEAL who'd saved his life. He wanted me to thank you for giving him 40 years he wouldn't have had. The fourth twist came when Frank realized that Jake's research had uncovered connections between his Vietnam service and events that had shaped multiple families across decades. Martinez, how many people have you identified from those old operations? Sir, I've been able to track down 12 surviving SEAL Team 1 veterans from your era. Most of them don't know that their service has been declassified and studied. Jake pulled out a folder from his car, containing photographs and documents that Frank hadn't seen in 50 years. Sir, the Navy wants to honor your unit at the next Special Warfare Heritage Ceremony. They want to recognize the classified operations that established the SEAL reputation for excellence. Frank looked through the documents, seeing mission reports, commendation recommendations, and operational summaries that had been buried in classified files when he'd returned from Vietnam. These were never supposed to see daylight. Sir, times have changed. The military is recognizing that classified doesn't mean forgotten. Your service mattered, and people need to know that. The folder contained letters from Vietnamese interpreters who'd worked with Frank's team, South Vietnamese officers who'd survived because of SEAL operations, and American soldiers who'd benefited from intelligence gathered during classified missions. Sir, your unit saved lives that created families that are still grateful 50 years later. The fifth and final twist came when Jake revealed the real reason he'd been searching for SEAL Team 1 veterans. Sir, Naval Special Warfare Command is establishing a legacy program to connect original SEALs with modern operators. They want you to help train the next generation. Frank stared at the young SEAL, trying to process the idea that his 40-year-old service in a classified unit could be relevant to modern military operations. Martinez, I'm 68 years old. What could I possibly teach modern SEALs? Sir, you could teach us what we've lost. Modern SEALs have incredible technology, advanced weapons, satellite communication. But you guys had something we're still trying to learn. What's that? How to operate with nothing but your teammates and your training. How to make life and death decisions without overhead support. How to succeed when failure means everyone dies. Jake gestured toward Frank's truck, noting the simplicity of his lifestyle, the absence of military memorabilia, the quiet dignity that came from men who'd proven themselves when it mattered most. Sir, every SEAL class learns about your unit's operations, but we learn them from textbooks and after-action reports. We need to learn from the men who lived them. Frank looked at the young SEAL who'd spent years researching operations that Frank had tried to forget, seeking wisdom from veterans who'd never been properly honored for their sacrifice. Martinez, what exactly are you asking me to do? Sir, I'm asking you to help us understand what made the original SEALs so effective. Not just the tactics and techniques, but the mindset, the brotherhood, the standards that made your unit legendary. 3 months later, Frank Morrison stood before a class of SEAL candidates at the Naval Special Warfare Center, wearing a dress blue uniform for the first time in 50 years, sharing stories that had been classified for decades. Gentlemen, warfare isn't about the equipment you carry or the support you receive. It's about the man next to you and your commitment to bringing him home alive. The candidates listened with the intensity that comes from understanding they were learning from a legend, someone who'd written the manual they were studying. Jake Martinez sat in the front row, taking notes on lessons that couldn't be found in any textbook, insights about leadership, sacrifice, and the bonds that connect warriors across generations. Sir, one candidate asked, what was the most important thing your team learned in Vietnam? Frank thought about the question for a long moment, remembering teammates who died in distant jungles, missions that had succeeded against impossible odds, and the weight of decisions that had affected people he'd never meet. We learned that being a SEAL isn't about individual heroics. It's about serving something larger than yourself and never forgetting that other people's lives depend on your commitment to excellence. After the class, Frank and Jake walked along the beach at Little Creek, watching young SEALs conduct training exercises in the surf. Martinez, why was this so important to you? Finding the old guys, connecting us with modern SEALs. Jake looked out at the ocean, thinking about his grandfather's stories, his own service, and the unbroken chain of warriors who dedicated their lives to protecting others. Sir, because excellence isn't inherited, it's taught. And the best teachers are the men who defined what excellence means when everything is on the line. Frank's involvement with the SEAL Legacy program grew over the following months, as he connected with other Vietnam veterans who'd served in classified units and helped establish training programs that combined modern technology with traditional warrior values. The program attracted attention from military historians, veteran organizations, and SEAL families who wanted to understand the heritage that connected past and present operators. What we're doing, Frank explained during a ceremony honoring SEAL Team 1 veterans, is making sure that the lessons learned in blood and sacrifice aren't lost when the men who learned them are gone. Jake Martinez was promoted to Petty Officer First Class and assigned to the Legacy program full-time, coordinating between veteran SEALs and active duty operators who were carrying forward a tradition that had begun in the rice paddies of Vietnam. Sir, Jake told Frank during one of their regular conversations, "My grandfather was right. You did save his life that day in the hospital. But you saved mine too, by teaching me what it really means to be a SEAL." The tattoo that had started their conversation in a Walmart parking lot had led to the restoration of connections that bridged 5 decades of service, proving that brotherhood doesn't end with discharge papers and that wisdom earned in combat is too valuable to be buried in classified files. Frank Morrison had thought he was just an old veteran buying dog food. Instead, he discovered that his service had never ended, it had simply evolved into a different kind of mission, one that involved teaching young warriors the values that made the original SEALs legendary. The ghost had become a teacher, and the student had become the bridge between past and future, ensuring that the traditions forged in the Mekong Delta would live on in every SEAL who understood that excellence is a legacy that must be earned by each generation.